It was Officer Rachel Turner's first time inside the old precinct, and she didn't like it one bit. "Are we really doing this?" she whispered to Mark, her older, grizzled partner, who was already pushing through the dust-filled air, flashlight steady in his hand. He shot her a look over his shoulder, smirking, though his eyes stayed sharp and cautious. "Don't be nervous, Rachel. It's just a building." He turned back toward the hallway stretching in front of them. "Besides, it's not like anyone's been here since. You know." He let the words hang in the stale, musty air. Rachel nodded, but the thought alone brought a chill to her skin. The Warren Street precinct had a dark history, and people in town still whispered about it. 10 years ago, a violent incident had left 3 officers dead. According to the reports, it was supposed to be a routine night, but something went wrong. By the end, 1 officer had survived, traumatized and mumbling incoherent warnings until he'd left the force and vanished from town. They'd shut the precinct down immediately after. Nobody wanted to work in a place tainted by tragedy, and the doors had remained sealed until today. The old precinct was due for demolition, and Chief Collins had sent them in to make a final sweep. They stepped deeper into the building, their footsteps echoing down the empty corridor. Rachel felt uneasy, as though the walls themselves were watching. Desks sat untouched, paperwork scattered as if everyone had left in a hurry. Dust hung thick in the air, and every breath felt like breathing in memories. "Mark," Rachel murmured, stopping mid-step. "Do you feel that?" Mark paused and looked around. "Feel what?" "The cold." The temperature had dropped suddenly, wrapping icy fingers around her arms and neck. She hugged her jacket closer, shivering despite herself. Mark shrugged, though he looked uncomfortable. "It's an old building, Rachel. Drafts happen. Just keep moving." But there was something in his voice, a hint of doubt. As they pressed on, the silence became heavier, as if the building itself was straining to hold it in. They passed the old cells, the metal doors hanging open and empty, and a quiet sound began to fill the air, a faint whisper, drifting from somewhere far away. Rachel stopped again, trying to catch it, to make out any words, but it vanished as quickly as it had come. They walked on in silence, tension coiling around them. Just as they reached a dusty interrogation room, Rachel heard it again, the whisper, clearer this time. A man's voice, faint but unmistakable, crackling through the static of her police radio. "All units, requesting backup. Shots fired. Officer down." The words cut off abruptly, leaving only the crackling static. Rachel and Mark looked at each other, their eyes wide. They both knew what they'd heard. Those were the words of Officer Jenkins, one of the officers who had died on that tragic night 10 years ago. Eddie himself. There must be some interference. Old radios maybe, but he didn't sound convinced. They moved forward, but Rachel's hands were shaking as she held her flashlight. Her heart was racing, her skin prickling with every shadow that stretched across the walls. They passed a row of lockers, and Rachel froze as she noticed something strange scratched into the paint. "Get out." The letters were jagged, deep, as though clawed by someone in a desperate hurry. Next to the message were faint, dark scratches running down the wall, marks left by fingernails. Rachel couldn't tear her eyes away. "Mark," she whispered, pointing to the words. Mark took one look and cursed under his breath. He turned, shining his flashlight down the hall, and his expression hardened. We've seen enough, Rachel. Let's wrap this up," he said, his voice steady but tense. They began to retrace their steps, but as they moved toward the exit, something changed. The air grew colder, and the building seemed darker, as if the shadows were deepening around them. Suddenly, they heard the sound of clinking metal, coming from the direction of the cells. It was faint, distant, but unmistakable. The sound of cell doors slamming shut, one by one. Rachel's heart pounded. Is there someone else in here?" she asked, barely able to keep her voice from shaking. Mark shook his head, gripping his flashlight tighter. "No, we're alone in here, or we should BBE." They picked up the pace, but as they neared the exit, they discovered something that made them both stop in their tracks. The doors, the heavy double metal doors they'd entered through, were shut tight. Mark stepped forward, grabbing the handle and pulling, but it didn't budge. "It's locked," he muttered, his voice laced with frustration. Rachel tried her radio again, her hands trembling, but all she got was static. She glanced back, and for a split second, she thought she saw movement, a flicker of darkness shifting at the end of the hallway. She blinked, and it was gone, but the unease lingered. A rumbling sound began to fill the air, low and deep, vibrating through the walls. Shadows seemed to shift and move, pooling in the corners and creeping along the walls, stretching closer with each passing second. Then the whispering started again. But this time, it wasn't just one voice. It was many, a chorus of voices, overlapping and rising, each one echoing from a different part of the precinct. "Help us. Don't leave us here. Please." Rachel grabbed Mark's arm, pulling him back as the shadows swirled around them. "Mark, we need to get out of here, now." They turned to look for another exit, sprinting down the hallway. The voices grew louder, more insistent, filling their heads with cries and pleas. The shadows twisted and writhed, reaching out as if to grab them, and suddenly, Mark stumbled, catching himself against a wall, his face pale and wide-eyed. "It's coming for me," he muttered, his voice barely a whisper. I can feel it." Rachel tugged on his arm, pulling him forward. "Come on, Mark. Don't stop. We're getting out of here." But Mark was frozen, staring at something only he could see. The shadows closed in, growing darker, and Rachel felt a coldness clawing at her chest, chilling her to the bone. She had to drag him down the hall, her breaths coming in short gasps as she searched for any way out. Finally, they reached a window, and with a desperate kick, Rachel shattered the glass. She helped Mark through, her hands shaking as she climbed out after him. They stumbled into the fresh night air, gasping for breath, the weight of the building's darkness lifting just enough for them to feel the warmth of the outside world. Chief Collins was waiting outside, his face drawn and tense. When he saw them, he walked over, giving them a long, knowing look. "What happened in there?" Rachel asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The chief looked at the old precinct, his expression dark. "You're not the first to see it," he said quietly. "This place keeps memories. Sometimes it won't let go." Rachel looked back at the shattered window, watching as shadows seemed to swirl and fade behind the glass. She could still hear the whispers echoing in her mind, and she knew one thing for certain. She'd never look at an empty precinct the same way again. Officer Aaron Lane didn't know what to expect when he got the call. His chief had assigned him the unusual task of checking out the old Linden Hill precinct, a building abandoned for over 2 decades. The town had built a new police station downtown, but rumors always circled about the old precinct. Some said it was haunted, that strange things happened to anyone who stayed there too long. But Aaron wasn't one to believe in ghost stories. He was a straightforward cop who liked facts. The old precinct was just a building, empty and forgotten, nothing more. The only reason he was here tonight was because of a report from a nearby resident who claimed they saw lights on inside. Probably just some kids sneaking in, he thought. It was nearly midnight as he parked his patrol car out front. The old building loomed in the dark, its brick walls cracked, windows darkened with dust and grime. The air around it felt heavy, as if the building itself was holding onto something it didn't want to release. Aaron sighed, grabbed his flashlight, and headed toward the front door. The doors were chained shut, but one of the windows near the front entrance was broken, a clear sign of trespassers. "Great," he muttered to himself. He climbed through the window, careful not to catch his uniform on the broken glass. Inside, the building was silent. The air was stale, thick with the smell of mold and dust. His footsteps echoed in the empty hallways as he moved slowly, scanning the dark corridors with his flashlight. Papers lay scattered across the floor, desks and chairs abandoned, as if the officers had left in a hurry. A faint chill settled over him as he continued down the main hallway. He paused, shivering. There was no power in the building, so it was cold, but this chill was different, unnatural, almost like a warning. He shrugged it off and kept walking. His flashlight beam swept across the walls, revealing old photos of officers and faded certificates. It was strange to think that this place had once been full of people. Now, it felt like a tomb. As he neared the back of the building, he heard a sound, a faint, rhythmic tapping, like someone lightly tapping their fingers on a table. He froze, listening carefully. The sound was coming from one of the rooms down the hall. "Hello?" he called out, his voice breaking the silence. The tapping stopped. He took a deep breath and approached the door. It was slightly ajar, creaking as he pushed it open with his foot. His flashlight beam swept across the room, illuminating a desk, an empty chair, and rows of filing cabinets. There was no one there. Aaron stepped inside, looking around. Papers were scattered across the desk, and a thick layer of dust coated everything. He glanced down at the papers, his eyes catching on a name scribbled in faded ink, Officer David Cole. He frowned, remembering the name. David Cole had been an officer who worked at Linden Hill when it was still active. The story went that he disappeared one night while working the late shift, never to be seen again. Some people said he'd run off, but others whispered that something had happened to him here, inside this very precinct. Suddenly, a noise behind him made him jump. He spun around, his flashlight catching a shadow moving just outside the door. He hurried back into the hallway, shining his light down the corridor. "Hello?" he called again, his voice louder, more forceful. Silence. He moved down the hall, his heartbeat quickening. He didn't believe in ghosts, but this place was starting to get to him. The shadows seemed to stretch and shift with each step he took, almost as if they were watching him. He decided to check the second floor, hoping to find some evidence of the trespassers who'd reportedly been seen inside. He found the stairs at the end of the hall, leading up to the darkened second floor. Each step creaked beneath his weight, the sound echoing through the empty building. As he reached the top of the stairs, he paused, listening. The air felt even colder up here, and the silence was thick, almost suffocating. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing more empty rooms, more abandoned desks. He was about to turn back when he saw something, a faint light flickering down the hallway. It was coming from one of the rooms at the far end of the corridor. He squinted, trying to make sense of it. There was no power in the building, so where was the light coming from? His pulse quickened as he approached the room. The light flickered again, casting shadows that danced across the walls. He reached the doorway and stepped inside, his flashlight sweeping over the room. There, on the desk, sat an old-fashioned lantern, the flame flickering gently. Aaron stared at it, his mind racing. There was no way this lantern could be lit. It was impossible. He took a step closer, reaching out to touch it, when suddenly he heard a voice. "Help me." He froze, his hand hovering over the lantern. The voice was soft, weak, and it sounded close. He turned, his flashlight beam darting around the room, but he saw no one. "Who's there?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Silence. He turned back to the lantern, but it was no longer lit. The flame had vanished, and the room was plunged into darkness once more. He took a step back, his heart pounding, his mind racing. He needed to leave. But as he turned to go, he heard it again, the voice, closer this time. "Help me. Please." The voice was filled with pain, desperation. He swallowed, feeling a surge of dread. Something was very wrong here. Gathering his courage, he followed the sound, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The voice led him down another hallway, to a door at the end that he hadn't noticed before. It was an old, rusted metal door, partially hidden behind a stack of boxes. He reached out, gripping the handle. It was ice cold to the touch, sending a shiver up his spine. He pulled the door open, revealing a narrow stairway descending into darkness. The voice echoed up from below. "Help me." He hesitated, every instinct telling him to turn back, but he couldn't ignore the plea. He took a deep breath and stepped onto the stairs, descending slowly, his flashlight casting long shadows on the walls. The stairs seemed to go on forever, twisting deeper into the darkness. The air grew colder, thicker, the smell of damp and decay filling his nostrils. Finally, he reached the bottom, finding himself in a small, dimly lit basement. The voice was louder now, closer. "Please, help him." He scanned the room, his flashlight illuminating old storage boxes, broken chairs, and crumbling walls. In the corner, he saw something that made his blood run cold. A figure, slumped against the wall, barely visible in the shadows. It was a man, his clothes tattered and dirty, his face pale and gaunt. His eyes were hollow, empty, staring into nothingness. Aaron took a step back, his heart racing. Are you all right?" he asked, his voice shaking. The man's head turned slowly, his empty eyes locking onto Aaron's. "They left me here," he whispered, his voice hoarse. They forgot about. Aaron swallowed, his mind racing. This couldn't be real. The man in front of him looked like he'd been here for years, trapped in the darkness. But that was impossible. He took another step back, his flashlight shaking. Who are you? The man's face twisted into a pained expression. They left me. They locked me in here and they never came back. Aaron's heart pounded as he realized who he was talking to. David Cole? The man nodded slowly, his eyes filled with sorrow. I was here that night, the night they all left. They said they'd come back, but they never did. Aaron's hands shook as he backed away, horror washing over him. David Cole had disappeared 20 years ago, but if this was him then? Before he could finish the thought, the man's face twisted into an expression of anger. You're one of them, one of the officers. You're just like them. Aaron stumbled back, his flashlight dropping from his hand as the man's figure began to shift, to change. Shadows wrapped around him, twisting and stretching, filling the room with an unnatural darkness. You'll stay here too, the voice whispered, echoing through the basement. You'll never leave. Aaron scrambled to his feet, his heart pounding as he stumbled toward the stairs. The shadows seemed to reach for him, clawing at his legs, his arms trying to pull him back. He ran up the stairs, his breaths coming in ragged gasps, the voice echoing behind him. You'll never leave, never. He burst through the door at the top, slamming it shut behind him. His hands shook as he fumbled with his flashlight, finally managing to turn it back on. He shone it down the hallway, expecting to see the shadows chasing him, but there was nothing, only silence. He stumbled toward the exit, his heart racing, his mind reeling. He didn't look back as he reached the front door, throwing it open and running outside, gasping for the fresh, cool night air. As he stood there, catching his breath, he glanced back at the building. The old precinct loomed in the darkness, silent and still, as if nothing had happened. But as he turned to leave, he heard it one last time, a faint, desperate whisper. Help me. He didn't look back. Pinewood Police Station was once a bustling place, full of officers and detectives working around the clock. But after a series of strange disappearances and eerie incidents, the station was abandoned over a decade ago. Since then, it had stood empty, gathering dust and shadows, left to decay at the edge of town. Locals avoided it, especially at night. They said that strange things happened there. Sounds, shadows. Some even claimed they had seen figures moving inside, glimpsed only in the corner of their vision. Officer Mike Turner was one of the few who didn't believe in the tales of Pinewood Station. Ghost stories were for kids, he thought. He was a man of logic and didn't put much stock in tales of haunted buildings. But late one October night, everything he thought he knew about fear would be tested. Mike was on a quiet night shift when the call came in. A local resident had reported strange noises coming from Pinewood Station. A figure, maybe more than one, had been seen moving inside. It was probably kids sneaking in for a thrill, he thought, but dispatch wanted someone to check it out. Mike drew the short straw, so with a sigh, he grabbed his flashlight and reluctantly drove to the abandoned station. The night was cold, and as he neared the building, he noticed the air felt even chillier. The place seemed to cast a shadow over everything around it, as if it drew darkness in from all sides. He parked his car in the cracked lot and stared up at the old building. The windows were broken, the brick walls cracked, and the entrance was covered in thick vines that looked like they were choking the life out of the structure. Mike got out of his car, grabbed his flashlight, and approached the front doors, which were slightly ajar. Strange, he thought. The doors were supposed to be sealed shut, with warnings posted outside to keep trespassers away. He pushed one door open, and it creaked loudly, echoing through the empty halls. The moment he stepped inside, Mike felt a chill run down his spine. The air was thick with dust and smelled of damp and decay. The dim light of his flashlight cast long shadows, making it feel like the darkness was closing in around him. He shook off the feeling, reminding himself that he was alone here. There were no ghosts, just an empty building. "Hello?" he called out, his voice echoing in the silence. "Anyone here?" Only silence answered him. He moved deeper into the station, his footsteps loud in the stillness. The floor was littered with papers, overturned chairs, and broken furniture. Dust covered everything, making it clear that no one had been here for years, or at least, that's how it looked. He scanned the old desks, remnants of a time when this place was full of life. Now, it felt like a tomb. As he walked through the lobby, he thought he heard something, a faint tapping sound coming from down the hall. He froze, his heart pounding. It was probably just a rat or some animal, he told himself, but the tapping continued, rhythmic and steady, like fingers drumming on a desk. He shone his flashlight down the hallway, but there was nothing there. Taking a deep breath, he walked slowly toward the sound. The hallway stretched ahead of him, its walls cracked and peeling, as if the building itself was trying to shed its skin. As he moved closer, the tapping grew louder. He finally reached the end of the hall and turned the corner, shining his light into the room from where the sound had come. The room was empty. Just a desk, an old chair, and rows of filing cabinets covered in dust. But the tapping had stopped, leaving only silence. Mike took a step into the room, feeling a strange sense of unease. His eyes fell on the desk, where a pile of old papers sat, untouched for years. On one of the papers, he saw a name written in faded ink, Officer Daniel Hart. Mike's stomach dropped. He remembered that name. Officer Hart had been one of the last officers to work at Pinewood Station. People said he was obsessed with a string of cases that had never been solved, cases involving missing people, disappearances around town. Hart had become withdrawn, spending hours alone at the station, even after it was supposed to be closed down. And then, one night, Officer Hart had vanished too. A sudden noise from the hallway made Mike spin around. It sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming closer. He stepped back, his heart pounding. The footsteps echoed, getting louder with each passing second. "Who's there?" he called out, trying to keep his voice steady. No answer. He pointed his flashlight down the hallway, but it was empty. The footsteps had stopped, leaving him in silence once more. He took a deep breath, telling himself it was just his imagination. But deep down, he felt that something was wrong. Very wrong. Mike turned to leave the room, but as he did, he noticed something strange. The papers on the desk had been disturbed. They were no longer covered in dust. Instead, they looked as if they'd just been touched, moved around. He could even make out faint fingerprints in the dust, as if someone had been shuffling through them moments before. Swallowing hard, he left the room and headed back down the hallway, his flashlight flickering slightly. The dim light cast eerie shadows on the walls, making it feel as though the building itself was watching him. He could hear his own breathing, quick and shallow, echoing in the silence. As he reached the main lobby, he saw something that made him stop in his tracks. The front door, the one he'd entered through, was now closed. He was sure he'd left it open. Mike approached the door, reaching for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. He pulled harder, but it was as if the door had been locked from the outside. Panic started to creep in. He was trapped. "Calm down," he muttered to himself. "It's just a door. There's another exit in the back." He turned and walked toward the back of the building, passing rows of empty cells and interrogation rooms. The further he went, the colder it seemed to get, and the silence grew heavier, pressing down on him like a weight. He finally reached the back exit, but as he reached for the handle, he heard something, a faint whispering voice. "Help me." Mike froze, his hand hovering over the handle. The voice was soft, almost pleading, as if it were coming from somewhere deep within the building. He shook his head, telling himself it was just his imagination, but the voice came again, louder this time. "Help me." His mind raced. The building was supposed to be empty, abandoned, but the voice sounded real, desperate. He turned away from the door, his flashlight flickering as he moved toward the sound. The whisper seemed to come from the stairwell leading to the basement. He hesitated. The basement was the one place he didn't want to go. He'd heard stories about it. The darkness, the cold, the strange noises that seemed to come from below, but something compelled him forward, as if he had no choice. The stairs creaked beneath his weight as he descended, each step echoing through the empty station. The air grew colder with every step, and the darkness seemed thicker, almost alive. When he reached the bottom, he found himself in a narrow hallway, lit only by the dim glow of his flashlight. The whispering continued, leading him down the hallway to a door at the end. He reached out, his hand shaking, and pushed the door open. Inside was a small room, empty except for a single chair in the center. Sitting in the chair was a figure, slumped forward, head hanging low. Mike's heart pounded as he stepped closer, his flashlight illuminating the figure's face. It was Officer Daniel Hart. The man's eyes were open, staring into nothingness, his face pale and lifeless. But then, slowly, Hart's head turned, and his hollow eyes locked onto Mike's. A shiver ran down Mike's spine as he realized that the figure was somehow alive. "Help me," Hart whispered, his voice weak and broken. Mike stumbled back, his flashlight shaking. You're supposed to be dead," he stammered. Hart's mouth twisted into a haunting smile. "I've been waiting here, waiting for someone to come. They left me, trapped in the darkness. And now, you're trapped, too." Mike backed toward the door, his heart racing, but before he could turn, the door slammed shut. He was locked in the room, alone with the ghostly figure of Officer Hart. Hart rose slowly from the chair, his movements unnatural, jerky, as if he were a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch and shift, twisting around him like dark tendrils. "You can't leave," Hart whispered. "You're part of this now, just like I was." Mike's hands fumbled for his radio, but there was only static. He tried the door again, pulling with all his strength, but it wouldn't budge. The shadows moved closer, wrapping around him, filling his vision with darkness. He heard Hart's voice, soft and sinister, echoing in his mind. "You'll stay here forever." With me, Mike screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness. The last thing he saw was Hart's hollow face, smiling as the shadows closed in, consuming him. Officer Mike Turner had been with the Pinewood Police Department for 6 years. The town was small, and most nights were quiet. But Pinewood had its share of dark stories. The old police station, now abandoned for years, was a source of many rumors. People said it was haunted. They said strange things happened there, that shadows moved when no one was around, and whispers echoed through the halls. Mike had heard it all, but he never believed in ghosts. He had grown up in Pinewood and knew the stories were just tales to scare kids. He liked to think of himself as a rational man, someone who looked for facts and evidence. But one night, he would find out just how wrong he was. It was a chilly October evening when the call came in. The dispatcher's voice crackled through the radio. "Officer Turner, we've received reports of noises coming from the old Pinewood station. Can you check it out?" Mike glanced at the clock. It was nearly midnight, and the thought of going out to the creepy old building made him uneasy. "Sure," he replied, forcing calmness into his voice. He grabbed his flashlight, put on his jacket, and headed out to his patrol car. The streets were empty, and the air felt heavy. As he drove to the old station, he felt a sense of dread creeping in. The old building loomed ahead, dark and silent, with broken windows and crumbling walls. It looked like a giant monster waiting to swallow him whole. He parked the car and stepped out, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The station was even scarier up close. The door was slightly ajar, creaking as he pushed it open. The inside was dark, and a musty smell hit him like a wall. Dust covered everything, and the air felt cold, almost unnatural. "Hello?" he called out, trying to sound brave. His voice echoed in the empty lobby. He took a deep breath and stepped inside, shining his flashlight around. The lobby was filled with old desks and papers scattered everywhere. The sound of his footsteps was the only thing he could. As he moved deeper into the station, he thought he heard something, a faint tapping sound coming from the back of the building. It was a rhythmic noise, like someone tapping their fingers on a table. He hesitated but decided he had to check it out. Following the sound, he walked down a narrow hallway. The walls were peeling, and shadows danced in the light of his flashlight. The tapping grew louder as he approached a door at the end of the hall. With a deep breath, he opened the door. The room was empty except for an old desk and a single chair in the center. Papers were strewn about, and a thick layer of dust covered everything. But as he stepped inside, the tapping stopped. He felt a chill run down his spine. "Is anyone here?" Mike asked, but only silence answered. He scanned the room, and then his flashlight flickered. He shook it, hoping to get it to work again. When the light steadied, he saw something on the desk, an old photograph. He picked it up and examined it. The picture was of the officers who had once worked in the station, smiling and full of life. but one face stood out, a young officer with dark hair and bright eyes. Mike recognized him as Officer Daniel Hart, who had gone missing years ago. Rumors had swirled around his disappearance, stories of him being obsessed with a case that had never been solved. A sudden noise pulled Mike's attention. It sounded like footsteps behind him. He spun around, his heart racing. The room was empty. He took a step back, bumping into the desk. The photograph slipped from his fingers and fell to the ground. As he bent to pick it up, he felt a chill in the air, like someone was watching him. "Get grip, Mike," he muttered to himself. He turned to leave the room when he heard it again, a faint whisper calling out from the hallway. "Help me." Mike's heart stopped. He stepped into the hallway, shining his flashlight in all directions. "Is someone there?" he called out, his voice wavering, but the only answer was silence. He took a deep breath and decided to head toward the stairs leading to the basement. If there was someone in the building, he needed to find. As he descended the stairs, the air grew colder, and he felt a sense of foreboding wash over him. The basement was darker than he expected, and the beam of his flashlight seemed weak against the thick darkness. He moved cautiously, scanning the room with his light. The basement was filled with old crates, broken furniture, and the remnants of what used to be a working station. Mike could see old files and papers scattered around, but something caught his eye, a door at the far end, slightly ajar. The whisper came again, softer this time, almost a plea. "Help." Against his better judgment, Mike approached the door. He pushed it open slowly, revealing a small, dark room. Inside, he saw a figure slumped in the corner. As he stepped closer, he realized it. "Are you okay?" Mike asked, his heart pounding. "What happened?" The man looked up, and Mike felt a rush of fear. It was Officer Daniel Hart, but his face was pale, and his eyes looked hollow, as if he hadn't slept in days. I've been waiting," Hart whispered. "They left." "Who left you?" Mike asked, confusion mixing with concern. "The shadows," Hart replied, his voice shaking. "They took me. They want you too." Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind Mike, plunging the room into darkness. He spun around, trying to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in as he turned back to Hart. "What do you mean they want me?" Mike shouted, feeling the walls close in around him. Hart's expression twisted with fear. "You shouldn't have come here. You must leave. They won't let you go." Mike felt a cold breath against his neck, sending chills down his spine. He turned, shining his flashlight into the darkness, but nothing was there. "Hurry, you have to escape," Hart cried, but the sound of his voice faded into whispers. The shadows around them began to shift, swirling like smoke. Mike felt something grab his ankle. He looked down to see dark tendrils creeping toward him, pulling him toward the corner of the room. "No, get away," he screamed, struggling against the darkness. "Fight it," Hart shouted. "You have to." Mike remembered his training. He took a deep breath and focused. "I won't let you take me," he yelled, pushing against the darkness with all his strength. The shadows hissed and recoiled, but they continued to pull at him. Hart reached out a hand. "You have to believe. Fight with everything you have." With a surge of determination, Mike broke free from the tendrils and rushed toward the door. He threw himself against it, and to his surprise, it swung open. He stumbled into the hallway, gasping for air. The whispers faded behind him, but he could still feel the cold breath of the shadows. He dashed up the stairs, heart racing. The door to the basement slammed shut behind him, but he didn't stop. He ran through the hallways, past the empty rooms and dark corners, not daring to look back. Finally, he reached the front door. He pushed it open and stumbled outside, gasping for breath. The night air was cold against his skin, but it felt like freedom. He ran to his patrol car, jumped inside and slammed the door shut. His hands trembled as he fumbled for the keys, but they fell to the floor. He bent down to grab them when he heard a tapping on the window. Mike looked up, heart racing. Outside, he saw a figure standing in the shadows. It was Hart, looking pale and ghostly. "You can't escape," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Door handle, trying to lock it, but the locks wouldn't catch. The shadows were closing in around him, creeping along the ground like a living thing. "Get away," Mike screamed, trying to start the car. The engine roared to life, and he slammed the car into gear, peeling out of the parking lot. He glanced in the rearview mirror. but the shadows seemed to fade as he drove away. Pinewood Station receded into the distance, and he felt a rush of relief. But as he turned onto the main road, he felt a cold chill wash over him. The darkness felt like it was still clinging to him, lurking just out of sight. He couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over, that the shadows would come for him again. Back at the police station, Mike sat at his desk, trying to process what had happened. He couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. He kept replaying the events in his mind. The whispers, the shadows. Officer Hart's ghostly face. He knew he had to report it. He had to tell someone about the darkness at Pinewood Station. But when he tried to speak to his chief, the words caught in his throat. No one would believe him. They would think he was losing his mind. Days passed, and Mike tried to put it behind him. But every night, he felt the weight of the shadows pressing down on him. He avoided the old station, but every time he closed his eyes, he saw Hart's face, heard the whispers calling for help. One evening, while he was on patrol, he drove past the abandoned building. The lights of his car illuminated the darkened windows, and for a moment, he felt a pull to stop. But he shook his head, reminding himself that he needed to stay away. Suddenly, his radio crackled to life. "Officer Turner, we have a situation at Pinewood Station. Reports of strange noises and lights. Can you respond?" Panic rose in his chest. He knew he had to go back, but he didn't want to face the darkness again. "Copy that," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. As he approached the station, he saw police lights flashing. Other officers were gathered outside, looking nervous. Mike parked his car and stepped out, feeling the familiar chill in the air. "What's going on?" he asked a fellow officer. "We got calls about lights and voices. People think it's haunted or something," the officer said, glancing at the building with unease. Mike's heart raced. He knew the darkness was real. "We need to get everyone out of here. It's not safe." The other officers looked at him, surprised. "What do you mean? It's just an old building." "No, it's more than that. We can't go in there," he insisted. But they were already moving toward the entrance. Feeling desperate, Mike followed them inside. The familiar musty smell hit him again, and the air felt heavy. As they moved through the darkened halls, he felt the shadows creeping around him, whispering, beckoning him. Suddenly, one of the officers screamed. "What was that?" They all turned toward the sound, and Mike's flashlight flickered. He could see shadows moving, darting along the walls, and the whispers grew louder. "Help me." The officers looked terrified. "We need to get out of here," someone shouted, but before they could turn back, the door slammed shut. Panic set in as the officers tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. The shadows closed in around them, and the whispers filled the air. "You should have never come back." Mike felt the darkness wrapping around him, pulling him into its depths. He tried to fight it, but it was too strong. "Get away," he shouted, but the shadows were relentless. As the whispers grew louder, Mike remembered Officer Hart's words. He had to believe he could escape. He had to fight back. Summoning all his strength, he shouted, "We're not afraid of you. We won't be trapped." The shadows recoiled, and the door flew open. The officers rushed out into the night, breathing hard, hearts pounding. They didn't stop running until they reached the safety of the parking lot. Outside, they gathered together, shaken but alive. The whispers faded behind them, but Mike knew they wouldn't be gone for. "Did you see that?" one officer said, looking back at the building. "What the hell was that?" Mike glanced at the station, its dark windows watching them. "It's not just a building. There's something evil inside. We have to warn everyone. We can't let this continue." The other officers nodded, fear etched on their faces. They would have to go back, bring more people, and find a way to confront the darkness. But deep down, Mike knew that the shadows would always be there, lurking, waiting for the next opportunity to reach out and pull someone into their cold embrace. Days turned into weeks, and the stories about Pinewood Station spread through the town. Some people were curious, eager to explore the abandoned building. Others were terrified, refusing to go near it. Mike couldn't shake the feeling of dread that settled over him every time he thought about it. One night, the chief called an emergency meeting. The department had received more reports of strange happenings near the station. It was time to take action. Mike felt a mix of fear and determination as he entered the meeting room. "We need to send a team back to the station," the chief said, looking serious. "We can't ignore these reports any longer." "I'll go," Mike said, raising his hand. "I know what's there. I've seen." The chief nodded. "We'll need more officers. This isn't going to be easy." As the meeting ended, Mike gathered a small team of officers willing to face the darkness. They equipped themselves with flashlights, radios, and other gear. The plan was to investigate, find out what was happening, and if necessary, exorcise the... That night, they arrived at Pinewood Station. The atmosphere felt heavy, and the air was thick with tension. Mike felt the familiar chill creep down his spine. He glanced at his team, who looked nervous but ready. "Stay close," he warned. "We need to stick together." They entered the station, and Mike led the way. The halls were just as he remembered, dark and foreboding. The whispers seemed to echo around them, taunting, calling them deeper into the building. Is anyone there?" Mike called, but his voice was swallowed by the darkness. As they moved through the station, strange things began to happen. Doors slammed shut on their own, shadows flickered in their peripheral vision, and the whispers grew louder, becoming a cacophony of voices. "Help us. Get out. We are trapped." Mike gripped his flashlight tightly, trying to focus on finding the source of the disturbances. They reached the basement door, and he hesitated. The last time he had been down there, it had been terrifying, but he knew they had to confront whatever was lurking in the darkness. "Let's check the basement," he said, trying to sound confident. The team exchanged nervous glances, but they followed him down the stairs. The basement was colder than ever. Shadows danced along the walls, and the whispers were deafening. Mike's heart raced as he shined his light around, trying to find something, anything, that could explain what was happening. Suddenly, one of the officers screamed. "Look!" He pointed toward the far wall, where a dark figure stood, partially hidden in the shadow. Mike squinted, trying to see through the darkness. "Who's there?" he shouted, feeling the weight of fear pressing down on him. The figure stepped forward, revealing a familiar face. It was Officer Hart, but he looked even more ghostly than before, his eyes hollow and filled with sorrow. "Help me," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the chaos of whispers surrounding them. "We're here to help you," Mike shouted, stepping forward. "What do you want?" Hart's expression twisted in anguish. "You need to leave. The darkness wants you. It wants to take..." Before Mike could respond, the shadows surged forward, wrapping around his team, pulling them into the depths of darkness. "No!" he yelled, trying to fight against the tendrils, but they were too strong. Hart reached out a hand. "Fight it. You must believe you can escape." Summoning all his strength, Mike shouted, "We are not afraid. We will not be taken." With a surge of determination, he pulled against the shadows, feeling them loosen their grip. The others followed his lead, fighting back with everything they had. "Believe in the light," Mike shouted, and as he did, a bright light began to fill the basement. The shadows shrieked and recoiled, and the whispers turned to scream. The darkness began to dissipate, and the figure of Hart shimmered. "You can do it! Push them back!" he cried, his voice stronger. With one final push, Mike and his team broke free from the shadows, stumbling back into the light. The basement was flooded with brightness, pushing the darkness away. As the shadows retreated, Mike looked at Hart, who smiled sadly. "Thank you. Now I can be free." With that, the figure of Hart began to fade, the darkness lifting from his face. Mike felt a sense of peace wash over him. They had confronted the darkness, and it had lost. The remaining officers gathered together, breathing hard but alive. They stepped back into the light of the main lobby, where the air felt fresh and warm. "We did it," Mike said, relief flooding through him. They had faced the darkness and won. But as they left Pinewood Station, Mike glanced back at the building one last time. The darkness was still there, lurking in the corners, but for now, it had been pushed back. The shadows had lost, but he knew they would always be waiting, hidden in the depths, ready to reach out for anyone who dared to come close. From that night on, the town began to heal. The stories about Pinewood Station changed. Instead of being a place of fear, it became a symbol of courage. Mike knew that the darkness might always be there, but so would the light, and as long as people believed in it, they would be safe.